My father was my hero. Growing up, he was the one who always stood by me, offering advice, encouragement, and a steady hand whenever life felt uncertain. Our bond was more than just a typical father-daughter relationship. It was a partnership built on mutual trust and love. I remember our Sunday afternoons together, sitting on the porch, sharing dreams about the future. He'd often talk about how everything he worked for was meant to give me a better life, a secure future. Those words shaped me, made me believe that no matter what challenges came my way, I could always count on him. Life wasn't perfect, of course. My mother passed away when I was 10, and the hole she left in our lives was something neither of us could ever fill. But we had each other. My father never remarried, focusing all his energy on raising me and building a legacy he said would one day be mine. As I got older, I worked hard to make him proud, excelling in school and landing a stable job. Every achievement felt like a tribute to his sacrifices. Things started to shift when I turned 25. My dad announced that he'd met someone, a woman named Clara. He spoke about her with an excitement I hadn't seen in years. Clara was kind, he said, and her 2 teenage kids were wonderful. At first, I was happy for him. He deserved companionship and happiness. But as time passed, the cracks began to show. Clara was charming, almost too charming. She had a way of commanding attention in every room she entered, often redirecting conversations to herself or her kids. Her children, while polite on the surface, were entitled in ways that rubbed me the wrong way. They treated my dad like an ATM, always asking for money or gifts, and he obliged without hesitation. I tried to dismiss my unease, chalking it up to an adjustment period. After all, I wanted my dad to be happy. But then came the bombshell. I was at his house one evening when he casually mentioned that he was updating his will. It caught me off guard, but I assumed it was just a routine adjustment. "You're still my priority," he said with a smile, and I believed him. That trust, however, was shattered a few weeks later when I overheard a conversation between Clara and her eldest son. They were talking about the family home, my family home, and how lucky they were to have secured such a future for themselves. Confused and alarmed, I confronted my dad. At first, he tried to dismiss my concerns. "They're just excited about the changes," he said. When I pressed further, his tone shifted. He admitted he had rewritten his will, leaving the majority of his assets, including the house, to Clara and her kids. "They're my family now, too," he explained, as if that justified taking everything he had once promised me. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. Everything he had built, everything he had promised, was now in the hands of strangers. Worse, he didn't seem to grasp why I felt so betrayed. "You're independent," he said. "You've got a good job. You don't need all this." His words stung more than I could have imagined. It wasn't just about the money or the house. It was about the trust we had shared, the promises he had made, and the belief that I mattered just as much as his new family. That night, I left his house feeling more alone than ever. The man who had once been my rock now felt like a stranger. I didn't know it then, but this betrayal would set off a chain of events that would change everything for me, for him, and for the family he had chosen over me. The days that followed felt like a fog, heavy and suffocating. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions, anger, confusion, and heartbreak, but most of all, I felt a deep sense of loss. How could the man who had always been my protector, my anchor, suddenly cast me aside? I tried to reason with myself, to rationalize his decision. Maybe he just wanted to keep peace in his new family. Maybe he thought he was doing the right thing. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the sting of betrayal. Clara and her kids became a bigger presence in his life, and it felt like they were erasing me bit by bit. Every time I visited, there were more signs of their influence. New furniture, framed photos of their vacations. Even the way my dad spoke changed. He started using phrases like "our family," and we decided, making it painfully clear that I was no longer at the center of his world. Each visit felt like a reminder of how much had changed and how little I belonged. Things came to a head one evening during a family dinner. Clara's son, Ethan, was bragging about how he'd convinced my dad to co-sign on a car loan. "It's only fair," he said smugly, "since he's basically our dad now." I bit my tongue, but the words burned inside me. Our dad? He wasn't their dad. He was mine. Yet here he was, giving them everything without a second thought. After dinner, I pulled my dad aside. I needed answers, needed to understand why he was so quick to give them everything while I was left with nothing. "Dad, this isn't fair," I said, my voice trembling. "You promised me my future, Mom's legacy, all of it. You said it was for me." He sighed, the way he used to when I was a child and asked too many questions. "I know you're upset," he said, his tone patronizing. "But you have to understand, Clara and the kids need me. They're my responsibility now. You're strong. You've built a good life for yourself. You don't need me like they do." His words were like a slap to the face. "I don't need you?" I echoed, my voice rising despite my best efforts to stay calm. "This isn't about needing you. It's about what's right, what you promised. How can you just give everything away?" He looked at me, his expression hardening. "It's done," he said firmly. "You need to accept it." That was the moment I realized this wasn't just a mistake or a misunderstanding. My father had made his choice, and it wasn't me. I left that night without saying goodbye, the weight of his words pressing down on me like a vice. The following week, I started noticing changes in how people treated me. Relatives who had always been warm and supportive suddenly became distant. Clara, it seemed, had wasted no time spinning her version of the story. In her narrative, I was the selfish, entitled daughter trying to sabotage her family's happiness. It was infuriating, but I refused to let her lies define me. One afternoon, I received a call from an old family friend. "I thought you should know," they said hesitantly. "Clara's been talking about selling the house, your mom's house." That was the final straw. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about protecting the legacy my mom and dad had built together. I couldn't sit back and let them destroy everything. That night, I sat down and did something I never thought I'd have to do. I contacted a lawyer. I didn't know much about estate law, but I was determined to learn. If my dad wasn't going to fight for what was right, I would. This wasn't just about getting back what was mine. It was about standing up for myself and the promises that had been broken. Little did I know, the battle ahead would be more brutal than I ever imagined. The lawsuit wasn't something I decided on lightly. It wasn't in my nature to resort to legal battles, especially not against my own father. But this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about the principle, about standing up for what was right and preserving my mother's legacy. My lawyer, a sharp and empathetic woman named Rachel, listened patiently as I laid everything out. The promises my father had made, the sudden changes after Clara entered the picture, and my discovery of the rewritten will. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair, her eyes thoughtful. "You have a case," she said firmly. "But I won't lie to you, this won't be easy. Contesting a will can get messy, especially when family is involved. Are you prepared for that?" I nodded. even though I wasn't sure I truly was. "I don't see another choice," I said quietly. "If I don't fight now, they'll take everything, and it'll be like my mom never existed." Rachel's expression softened. "Then let's get to work." The first step was gathering evidence. I spent days combing through old documents, photographs, and letters, anything that could prove my father's original intentions and the promises he'd made. Each item I found felt like unearthing a piece of my past, a reminder of the man he used to be before Clara's influence. There was a handwritten note from him on my high school graduation day, promising that he'd always have my back. There were old legal documents showing the house was originally purchased with my mother's inheritance. Every discovery brought a mix of comfort and pain, but it also strengthened my resolve. As the lawsuit moved forward, the tension in the family reached a boiling point. Clara and her kids didn't hold back their disdain for me. They painted me as a greedy, ungrateful daughter, someone who was trying to destroy their newfound happiness out of spite. Clara, in particular, seemed to delight in fanning the flames. "She just can't stand that your father finally has a real family," she told mutual acquaintances, ensuring her words would reach me. But the hardest part was my father. He avoided me completely, refusing to answer my calls or meet with me in person. When we did cross paths, usually in the courtroom, his gaze was cold, distant, as if I were a stranger. It broke my heart to see how far we'd fallen, but I couldn't let his silence deter me. If anything, it fueled my determination to see this through. In the courtroom, things became even more revealing. Rachel presented a strong case, showing how my mother's inheritance had funded the family home and how my father had repeatedly promised it would be passed down to me. But Clara's legal team was relentless, arguing that my father had every right to change his will and distribute his assets as he saw fit. They painted him as a man simply trying to provide for his new family, implying that I was selfish for wanting to take that away. The emotional toll was immense. Each hearing felt like a battle, not just over property and money, but over the very fabric of my relationship with my father. Every time Clara and her kids testified, spinning their version of events, it felt like another dagger to the heart. And yet, amidst all the lies, there were moments of truth that shone through. One such moment came when a longtime family friend took the stand. "I've known this family for decades," they said firmly, "and I can tell you this: Protagonist was everything to her father. He always said he was building his future for her. What's happening now? It doesn't make sense." As the hearing adjourned that day, Clara shot me a venomous look as she stormed out of the courtroom, her children trailing behind her. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for certain. The battle was far from over, and I wasn't backing down. The pressure of the lawsuit weighed heavily on me, but it also revealed who my true allies were. While some family members avoided me altogether, unwilling to get involved in the drama, others quietly reached out to offer their support. One of them was my aunt, my mom's younger sister, who had been keeping her distance ever since my dad remarried. "I didn't want to interfere," she admitted when she called one evening, her voice hesitant. "But your mom would never forgive me if I stayed silent while they tried to erase her legacy. What they're doing, it's wrong." Her words brought a wave of emotion I hadn't allowed myself to feel in weeks. "Thank you," I whispered, barely able to get the words out. "I can't tell you how much this means to me." My aunt didn't just offer moral support, she provided valuable insight. She reminded me of details about my mom's contributions to the family's assets, stories about how my parents built their life together, and even a few old documents she had tucked away. One of them was a photocopy of the original will my parents had drafted together before my mom's passing. It named me as the sole beneficiary of their estate. Holding that piece of paper in my hands felt like holding a part of my mom herself. It was the validation I needed to keep going. But as I prepared for the next phase of the lawsuit, my father's resistance grew stronger. Through his lawyer, he filed a counterclaim, accusing me of trying to manipulate him and destroy his marriage. The accusations were baseless, but they stung nonetheless. Reading the cold, calculated words in the legal documents felt like another knife to the heart. The father who had once been my greatest champion now seemed determined to paint me as the villain. Meanwhile, Clara and her children ramped up their efforts to discredit me. They began spreading rumors, claiming I was financially unstable and desperate for money. One of Clara's daughters even took to social media, posting vague but pointed comments about entitled people who can't handle change. It was petty and infuriating, but I refused to stoop to their level. I knew the truth was on my side, and I was determined to let the evidence speak for itself. In the courtroom, the battle intensified. Rachel's strategy was methodical, dismantling Clara's narrative piece by piece. She presented the photocopy of the original will, along with testimony from my aunt and other family friends who had witnessed my parents' intentions firsthand. Each piece of evidence painted a clear picture. My mom and dad had built their life together with the explicit plan to leave everything to me. Clara's arrival had upended that plan, but her manipulation was becoming harder to deny. The turning point came when Rachel subpoenaed financial records showing that Clara had been quietly funneling money from my dad's accounts into her own. The records revealed extravagant purchases, luxury vacations, high-end jewelry, and even a down payment on a second property. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as the evidence was laid out. For the first time, Clara's confident demeanor faltered. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, avoiding eye contact with anyone, including my father. I stole a glance at him, hoping to see some flicker of realization, some acknowledgement that he had been deceived. But his face remained unreadable, his jaw set in a stubborn line. My heart ached as I realized that even now, he might still choose to defend her. As the day ended, Rachel turned to me with a small, triumphant smile. "We're making progress," she said quietly. "They're starting to crack." But even as I allowed myself a glimmer of hope, I knew the battle was far from over. Clara and her children were cornered, and cornered people often made desperate moves. What I didn't realize was just how far they were willing to go to hold on to what they believed was theirs. The courtroom had grown colder, more combative. Each day felt like a new test of endurance, with Clara and her children pulling every trick to discredit me. Yet, Rachel's meticulous strategy was unraveling their defenses. Each revelation chipped away at the facade they had so carefully constructed. But I knew better than to celebrate prematurely. Desperation had a way of bringing out the worst in people, and I was about to find out just how far they were willing to go. It started with a call in the middle of the night. My phone buzzed relentlessly, dragging me from restless sleep. On the other end was my cousin, her voice frantic. "Did you see what they posted?" she blurted out, not even pausing for me to respond. I scrambled out of bed, opened my laptop, and logged into social media. There it was, a lengthy post from Clara's eldest daughter, filled with lies and half-truths. "She's doing this because she's broke," the post read. "She's jealous of our family and can't handle the fact that Dad has moved on. This lawsuit isn't about fairness. It's about her greed." Attached were out-of-context photos and snippets of conversations meant to paint me as vindictive and selfish. My stomach churned as I scrolled through the comments. People I didn't even know were chiming in, siding with them, accusing me of tearing my father's family apart. It was humiliating, infuriating, and deeply unfair. Rachel had warned me this could happen, but nothing could have prepared me for the emotional toll. It wasn't just about defending my reputation. It felt like I was fighting for my very identity. The next day in court, I walked in with my head held high, even though I felt anything but confident. Rachel was prepared. She presented more financial records showing how Clara's manipulations extended far beyond what we initially uncovered. Bank statements revealed not only extravagant purchases, but also suspicious transfers to accounts belonging to Clara's children. The tension in the room was palpable. Clara's lawyer scrambled to offer explanations, but the evidence was damning. Even the judge seemed unimpressed with their weak rebuttals. For the first time, it felt like I was gaining the upper hand. But then, something happened that I hadn't anticipated. My father took the stand. As he walked to the witness box, I couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness. This was the man who had taught me to ride a bike, who had cheered me on at every school play, who had promised me the world. Now he was here to testify against me. When he began to speak, his voice was steady but lacked the warmth I once knew. "I love my daughter," he said, glancing at me briefly. "But she's wrong about this. Clara has been nothing but good to me. She's supported me in ways no one else has since my wife passed away. This lawsuit is tearing our family apart." I felt my heart shatter all over again. Even with the evidence laid bare, even with the lies and manipulation exposed, he was still choosing them over me. As he continued, I noticed Clara's smug expression. She leaned back in her chair, a picture of confidence, as if she had already won. But Rachel wasn't done yet. When it was her turn to cross-examine, she asked my father a series of pointed questions. "Do you remember the original 'Will you signed with your first wife?'" she asked, her tone firm but respectful. "The one that outlined your intent to leave everything to your daughter?" He hesitated, glancing at Clara before answering. "I do," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "And do you recall telling your daughter on numerous occasions that your assets, including the house, were meant for her as part of her inheritance?" "Yes," he said, almost reluctantly. Rachel didn't let up. "So, what changed? Why rewrite the will? Why transfer everything to Clara after decades of making your intentions clear?" He opened his mouth to respond, but faltered. The silence stretched, and for the first time, he looked uncertain. Clara shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her confidence beginning to waver. It was a small crack, but it was enough to remind me that the truth had a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply it was buried. As the day ended, I left the courtroom emotionally drained, but more determined than ever. My father might have chosen to side with Clara, but the facts were on my side, and I was ready to fight until the very end. The next morning, I woke up to a message from Rachel asking me to meet her at her office before the hearing. "There's something you need to see," she said cryptically. The tone of her voice made my heart race with both curiosity and dread. I arrived at her office to find her sifting through a stack of newly obtained documents, her brow furrowed in concentration. "These just came in from the subpoena on Clara's financials," Rachel said, sliding a folder across the desk to me. I opened it and froze. There, in black and white, was evidence that Clara had been funneling money out of my father's accounts into offshore accounts in her name. The amounts were staggering, hundreds of thousands of dollars over the past few years. It was more than enough to prove that she had been taking advantage of my father financially. Rachel leaned back in her chair, her expression grim. This isn't just about inheritance anymore. What Clara's been doing is illegal. If we present this in court, it could turn the tide completely. For a moment, I didn't know how to feel. Relief? Vindication? Anger? The evidence was damning, but it also meant dragging my father even deeper into this mess. Would he believe the truth? Or would he continue to defend her, no matter how much she had deceived him? The courtroom was tense that day. Clara and her children had no idea what was about to hit them. As Rachel presented the new evidence, there was an audible gasp from the gallery. Clara's lawyer immediately objected, but the judge allowed the documents to be entered as evidence. The tension in the room was almost tangible as Rachel laid out the timeline of Clara's actions, connecting the dots between the transfers and her lavish spending. Clara's confident facade cracked completely. Her face turned pale, and she glanced nervously at her lawyer, who was clearly struggling to come up with a defense. Her children looked equally stunned, their earlier smugness replaced with wide-eyed fear. When it was Clara's turn to testify, she tried to spin the narrative. "I only did what I thought was best for the family," she said, her voice trembling. "I was helping manage the finances. My intentions were never malicious." Rachel didn't let her off the hook. "Helping manage finances?" she repeated, holding up the documents. "You're telling this court that funneling money into offshore accounts and using it for personal expenses, like luxury vacations and private school tuition, is helping manage finances." Clara stammered, her composure crumbling further. The judge didn't look convinced either. The weight of the evidence was impossible to ignore. But the most heartbreaking moment came when Rachel called my father back to the stand. This time, he looked smaller, defeated. Rachel showed him the evidence and asked him to explain the transactions. He looked at the documents, his hands trembling. I didn't know about this," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "And now that you do?" Rachel pressed gently. "What do you think this says about Clara's intentions?" For a moment, the courtroom was silent. My father looked at me, his eyes filled with a mix of guilt and something else I couldn't quite place. Regret, maybe, or sorrow. "I don't know what to think anymore," he said finally, his voice cracking. As the day ended, I left the courtroom with a strange mix of emotions. Clara's grip on my father was finally slipping, but the cost of this battle was becoming clearer by the day. This wasn't just about winning an inheritance. It was about exposing the truth, no matter how painful it was for everyone involved. And as much as it hurt, I knew I couldn't stop now. The fallout from the courtroom revelations hit hard. Clara and her children, once so bold and self-assured, were now scrambling to maintain their footing. The evidence of her financial deception had shaken not just the case, but also the very foundation of her relationship with my father. For the first time, I saw the cracks in their alliance. Clara was desperate, her veneer of control slipping with every passing day. Meanwhile, my father grew more distant. He hadn't called or texted since his last testimony, and while I told myself it didn't matter, the silence gnawed at me. I wanted to believe that he was processing everything, coming to terms with the truth, but a part of me feared that he was simply retreating further into Clara's narrative. A few days later, Rachel called me with surprising news. Clara's lawyer had approached her to discuss a settlement. "They're feeling the pressure," Rachel explained. "They know their case is falling apart, and they're trying to cut their losses." At first, the idea of a settlement felt like a victory. After all, wasn't this what I wanted? To reclaim my inheritance, to secure what was rightfully mine? But as Rachel outlined the terms, financial compensation in exchange for dropping the lawsuit, I felt a pang of hesitation. Accepting the settlement meant avoiding further legal battles, but it also meant letting Clara and her family off the hook. There would be no accountability for their actions, no real justice. "I need to think about it," I told Rachel. She nodded, her expression understanding. "Take your time," she said, "but don't wait too long. These offers don't stay on the table forever." That night, I found myself driving to the family home, the house that had once been the heart of my world. It looked different now, colder somehow. The front yard was overgrown, and the cheerful garden my mom had tended so lovingly was gone. As I sat in the driveway, memories flooded back. Birthday parties, late-night talks with my dad, my mom's laughter echoing through the halls. This wasn't just a house. It was a symbol of everything we had built as a family. I didn't realize I was crying until I heard a voice behind me. "You shouldn't be here." I turned to see my father standing on the porch, his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he walked down the steps, stopping a few feet away from me. "What do you want?" he asked, his tone weary. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my voice. "I came to remind myself why I'm fighting. This house. It's more than just walls and a roof. It's Mom's legacy. It's everything we were supposed to protect." He looked away, his jaw tightening. "You think I don't know that?" he said quietly. "You think I don't feel the weight of every decision I've made? Then why?" I asked, my voice breaking. "Why did you let this happen? Why did you choose them over me?" His shoulders slumped, and for the first time, I saw the man behind the stubborn exterior. He looked older, tired, as if the weight of the last few months had finally caught up to him. "I thought I was doing the right thing," he admitted. "After your mom." I was lost. Clara made me feel like I could have a family again, like I wasn't alone. I didn't see what she was really doing. "And now?" I asked, searching his face for some sign of understanding. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned back toward the house, his gaze lingering on the windows. "I don't know," he said finally, "but I'm starting to think I've made a terrible mistake." It wasn't the resolution I'd hoped for, but it was a start. As I drove away, I felt a small flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, my father was beginning to see the truth. But I knew better than to let my guard down. Clara and her family wouldn't go quietly, and the battle was far from over. The settlement offer lingered in my mind, tempting me with the possibility of closure. Yet every time I considered accepting it, I thought of my mom, of everything she had worked so hard to build. Settling felt like giving up, like letting Clara and her children erase her legacy without consequence. I couldn't do that. Not for money, not for peace, and certainly not for convenience. Rachel was supportive of my decision to reject the offer. "This will make them fight harder," she warned. "But it also shows them you're serious. If they thought they could scare or bribe you into backing down, they were wrong." The next court session was a turning point. Rachel presented her final arguments, weaving together every piece of evidence we had gathered. She painted a vivid picture of the family my parents had built and the promises my father had made to me over the years. She detailed how Clara had systematically taken advantage of his trust, draining his accounts and rewriting his legacy for her own benefit. The judge listened intently, her expression carefully neutral, but I could see hints of sympathy in her eyes. When it was Clara's turn to speak, her lawyer tried to redirect the narrative, claiming that my father had made his decisions willingly and that their family had only ever acted in his best interest. But the weight of the evidence was too heavy to ignore. The financial discrepancies, the testimonies from family friends, and even Clara's own missteps during cross-examination had all built a case that was impossible to deny. The most dramatic moment came when my father was called to the stand for what would be his final testimony. By this point, he seemed worn down, his once proud posture now slouched with exhaustion. Rachel approached him with a gentleness I hadn't seen before. "Mr. Harper," she began, "do you still believe that your decision to rewrite your will and transfer your assets to Clara and her children was in the best interest of your family?" He hesitated, his gaze flicking between Rachel, the judge, and me. For a moment, the silence felt unbearable. Then he sighed, a long, heavy sound that seemed to carry the weight of his regrets. "No," he said finally, his voice low but steady. "I don't." The courtroom was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Clara's face twisted in disbelief, her lawyer scrambling to recover. But my father wasn't finished. "I made a mistake," he continued. "I let myself be blinded by what I thought was love, by what I thought was a second chance at happiness. I didn't see what was really happening until it was too late." Rachel nodded, giving him a moment before asking her next question. "And what do you believe should happen now?" He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mix of pain and something I hadn't seen in a long time. Guilt. "I want to make things right," he said. "I want to fix what I've broken." For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't a full reconciliation, not yet, but it was a start. Clara and her children, meanwhile, were in full damage control mode. They whispered furiously among themselves, their confident facade completely shattered. The judge adjourned the hearing to review the case, giving us all a brief reprieve. Outside the courtroom, my father approached me hesitantly. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "For everything." I nodded, my emotions too raw to form a proper response. There was still so much to unpack, so much hurt to heal. But in that moment, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in a long time: hope. The legal battle wasn't over yet, but the tide was turning. Clara's lies had been exposed, and my father was finally beginning to see the truth. For the first time in months, I felt like justice might actually be within reach. And no matter how long it took, I was ready to see it through to the end. The final days of the trial were a whirlwind of emotions. Clara and her lawyer were clearly on the defensive, desperately trying to salvage what little credibility they had left. Their arguments had grown weaker, more scattered, and their once confident demeanor was now tinged with desperation. Meanwhile, Rachel continued to press forward with precision and resolve, leaving no stone unturned. As the final hearing approached, I found myself reflecting on everything that had led to this moment. The pain of betrayal, the loneliness of being cast aside, the sheer exhaustion of fighting what felt like an uphill battle. It had all brought me here. But so had the love I had for my mom, the memories we had created in that house, and the promises my dad had once made to me. It wasn't just about the inheritance anymore. It was about standing up for what was right and reclaiming the parts of my life that had been taken from me. The courtroom was packed on the day of the verdict. Journalists, extended family members, and even a few friends had come to witness the conclusion of the case. As I walked in, I could feel the weight of their gazes, their whispers a faint hum in the background. I kept my head high, focusing on the task at hand. The judge began by summarizing the key points of the case. She spoke about the evidence presented, the testimonies given, and the troubling financial irregularities that had been uncovered. Every word felt like a drumbeat in my chest, the tension building with each passing second. When she finally delivered her decision, the room fell silent. In light of the evidence presented, it is clear to this court that the defendant, Clara Harper, acted in a manner that was not in the best interest of the estate or Mr. Harper's family. The court finds in favor of the plaintiff and orders that the contested assets, including the family home, be returned to the original terms outlined in the earlier will a wave of relief washed over me as the judge continued, outlining further legal consequences for Clara's financial misconduct. Clara's face was a mask of disbelief and fury. Her lawyer slumped in defeat. Her children sat frozen, their earlier bravado completely gone. But my focus was on my father. He sat quietly, his expression unreadable. When the judge concluded, he stood and walked toward me. For a moment I thought he might turn away, that he would retreat into the shell he had built around himself. But then he stopped in front of me, his eyes meeting mine. "I'm sorry," he said again, this time with more conviction. "I didn't just fail you. I failed your mother. I let her memory be tarnished, and I'll never forgive myself for that." I wanted to lash out, to tell him how much his betrayal had hurt, but instead, I simply nodded. "You can't change the past," I said, my voice steady, "but you can help me protect what's left." He nodded slowly, understanding what I meant. There was still a long road ahead. Our relationship was far from healed, and the scars from this battle would take time to fade. But in that moment, I saw a glimmer of the man he used to be, the father who had once been my greatest ally. As I left the courthouse that day, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in months. The fight had been grueling and the victory bittersweet, but justice had been served. The house, my mom's legacy, and my sense of self were intact. Clara and her family were out of our lives, and while the wounds they left behind would take time to heal, I knew I had taken the first step toward moving forward. It wasn't just a legal victory, it was a personal one. I had found my voice, reclaimed my strength, and proven to myself that I was capable of fighting for what mattered. And as I stood outside the courthouse, the sun breaking through the clouds, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope for the future. The days following the verdict were a blur of paperwork, conversations, and quiet reflection. Reclaiming the family home felt surreal. Walking through its halls again, I could still see shadows of the life we once lived. My mom's laughter in the kitchen, my dad reading on the couch, me running down the stairs on Christmas morning. The house had always been more than just walls. It was a container for all the memories, the love, and the life we had shared. Now, it was mine to protect. But there was more than the house to deal with. My father and I began the tentative process of repairing our relationship. It wasn't easy. Years of trust couldn't be rebuilt overnight, especially after the betrayal we had endured. Still, he made an effort. He started visiting me, asking questions about my life, and most importantly, listening when I spoke. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Clara and her children had disappeared from our lives entirely. After the financial revelations, Clara faced further legal consequences, and whatever hold she had over my father was broken. Part of me felt sorry for him. He was a man searching for connection, and in his vulnerability, he had allowed himself to be deceived. But he had also made a choice to prioritize them over me, and that wasn't something I could forget easily. As time passed, I poured myself into restoring the house. It became a labor of love, a way to honor my mom and reclaim the parts of my life that Clara had tried to erase. I repainted the walls, revived the garden, and filled the rooms with photos and mementos from the past. With each change, the house felt less like a battleground and more like a home again. One evening, as I stood in the garden, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink, my father joined me. He looked at the house, his expression a mix of pride and sadness. "Your mom would be happy to see this," he said softly. "You've brought it back to life." I nodded, feeling a lump rise in my throat. "She built this life for us," I said. "The least I could do is protect it." He turned to me, his face etched with regret. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said, "but I hope one day you can understand why I did what I did." I looked at him, searching for the right words. "I'm trying," I said honestly, "but it's going to take time." He nodded, accepting my answer. It wasn't a resolution, but it was progress, a step toward rebuilding what we had lost. As the weeks turned into months, I began to feel a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. The battle for my inheritance had been grueling, but it had also taught me so much about myself, my strength, my resilience, and my ability to fight for what mattered. It wasn't just about winning back the house or the money. It was about reclaiming my voice and my place in the world. Standing in that garden, I felt a quiet sense of closure. My journey wasn't over, but I knew I was heading in the right direction. And for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to embrace whatever the future held.